Damaged Defenders by Sherza. Chapter 53. Jarvis and Natasha. To say Jarvis was pissed off that someone had tried to kill one or more of his charges was to vastly understate the case. Unfortunately, there was little he could do about the situation other than initiate the emergency lockdown for the Avengers floors. That and monitor the tower itself more closely than he normally did. It was late enough in the day that traffic in and out of the tower had become minimal, which made that task easier. Traffic never quite stopped. The tower, like the rest of the city, never truly slept. But at this hour, there weren't many people going in and out. Jarvis took note of the unknown blonde wearing a well-tailored suit and carrying a briefcase who entered the tower 5 minutes and 32 seconds after the lockdown had been initiated. On first examination, the woman seemed ordinary enough. She did not have a Stark Industries placard, but that was hardly unusual, as non-employees were frequent visitors to the tower for any number of reasons. Unfortunately, it was not a perfect infiltration attempt. The first alarm went up when she did not stop at the desk for a visitor's pass or to let the guard know who she was there to meet. Jarvis did a very fast check to make sure she wasn't a new hire at that point. It was possible that she was someone whom he hadn't met, either in person or via reviewing their file, yet, and would thus not immediately recognize as belonging in the tower. She could also be one of the relief personnel who had been given access to the lower floors of the tower during the initial stages of the cleanup from the aborted invasion. When he didn't come up with any matches in either place, Jarvis brought the defenses that Sir had built into the tower online and discreetly contacted the head of security. That last proved to have been a bad decision. The woman, upon being approached by security, abruptly went on the offensive. As good as the tower security personnel were, they were no match for the woman. Jarvis noted in the minute or so that it took her to disable the team that her moves were very reminiscent of Agent Romanov's. Given Agent Romanov's occupation and bosses of record previous to her joining S.H.I.E.L.D., Jarvis would have had no compunctions about resorting to extreme measures if such became necessary. For now, he would attempt lesser measures once. When she slipped into the thankfully empty women's bathroom on the main floor, Jarvis locked the door and flooded the room with knockout gas. Unfortunately, she did not immediately succumb, much to Jarvis's surprise. It took far more of the gas to knock her out than it did for the average person. Fortunately, Jarvis was able to control the only 2 points of egress, the door and the vent, and she was then able to escape before she finally succumbed to the gas. Once she was finally down, Jarvis sent in another security team, and the woman was trussed up, as the saying went, like a turkey, and brought to a holding cell down in the basement. No fools. They performed a thorough strip search of the woman before putting her in the beige one-piece jumpsuit and then putting her in the cell. Jarvis armed all the containment measures in the cell, a step that would normally be unnecessary as the cell was proof against most detainees. Given Agent Romanov's skills and this woman's resistance to the knockout gas, Jarvis was taking no chances. Whatever. Any attempt to break out would see her gassed and or dazed into a consciousness. If she got particularly difficult before Sir or one of the other Avengers could deal with her, Jarvis had more permanent methods of taking care of the problem at his disposal. Unfortunately, at that point, Thor and Loki had returned with the other would-be assassin, and it swiftly became clear to Jarvis that Sir and the other Avengers would not be dealing with a woman for some time. Very likely not until morning, if then. Natasha might not quite have been in Clint and Steve's leagues when it came to math, but she wasn't far behind them. So it didn't take her long to translate the numbers Jarvis gave them on the bullet's trajectory to realize the assassin had been aiming for her. It was hardly the first time in her long life that someone had tried to take her out, so she wasn't even really upset about it. The only question was who was behind this attempt. It didn't take long for the rest of the Avengers to show up on Phil's floor. Tony looked rather more murderous than Natasha had expected him to be. The man may have made a place for them in his home, but it did not immediately follow that he was emotionally attached enough to them to take an assassination attempt on one of them personally. Bruce had a very fixed expression of calm on his face. Natasha strongly suspected he was working to not transform. The rest of the Avengers were all varying shades of pissed off or worried. About 15 minutes after the alarm had been raised, Loki and Thor teleported into the room with them. A man floated a foot off the floor between them, wrapped in some sort of energy that shimmered green and gold. Natasha assumed it was a visual manifestation of Loki's magic. That, however, was secondary to the identity of the would-be assassin. Natasha cursed briefly, if virulently, in Russian. Phil and Clint were only seconds behind her as the identity of the assassin registered with them, though their reactions were far more contained. Phil's expression barely flickered, but from him a brief frown was not a good thing. Clint's expression morphed to a level of murderous that surpassed Tony's, though he didn't say a thing. Okay, Tony said. From that reaction, this is worse than I am assuming it is, which, given we're dealing with an assassination attempt.
Yes, Natasha said. His presence means my old trainers, for lack of a better term, have decided how they are going to react to us and the invasion. I would not have been the only target, just the first. But this is complicated. He is...
Natasha hesitated for a moment. Part of her did not want to explain, even a little. Not even Clint or Phil knew everything, though she'd trusted both of them with quite a lot more than she'd ever trusted anyone else with. That's how they'd recognized the assassin. But she was going to have to explain, at least in part, otherwise... Well... After the war, Russia made its own attempts at super soldiers. They approached this in two parts. They wanted superior infiltrators, capable of becoming whoever was required, in order to gain intel and assassinate targets that could not be eliminated by more traditional means. From that effort came myself and several other girls. All of us bore the codename of Black Widow, Natasha told them. She could tell by the looks on most everyone's faces that they were filling in the blanks she was leaving in the story and not liking it much.
We were a little more than dogs to them, perhaps less. We were allowed no sense of self, no independence. We did not even realize what they were doing was wrong. Then when I was 10, or at least they said I was 10, I would not trust those people if they told me the sky was blue now. They brought him in to train us.
Natasha motioned to the assassin.
That is when I began to realize that what they were doing was wrong, because as badly as they treated us, they treated him worse. They did not even treat him like he was a living being. He was nothing but a gun to be maintained to them. They hardly spoke to him, and did not even afford him so much as a code name amongst themselves. If they had to refer to him, it was the asset.
Natasha sighed.
After our training with him was completed, he disappeared again. I encountered him again a few years later, once I was fully trained. We were sent on a mission together. That was when I discovered just how badly he was treated, even compared to myself and my fellow widows. A few days into our mission, he began to change, to become erratic and evince something that approached a personality, if a very beaten down one. The next day, we were called back to base. He disappeared for a few hours, and when he returned, he was once more the mindless automaton.
So they were, brainwashing him somehow? Tony asked, sounding pissed. The rest of the Avengers and their various hangers-on weren't any better. Loki had joined Clint in wearing a seriously murderous expression, and Bruce was looking a touch green around the gills in a Hulk-out imminent way.
Yes,
Natasha said.
I never discovered how precisely they were doing it. None of the widows were ever permitted into the areas where he was kept.
Which means he's not doing any of this of his own free will, Steve said. That, rather understandably, changed the equation they were dealing with. If this guy had been trying to kill them of his own free will, well, there was really only one possible response to that. Comes the next question. Can he become a functional person, or do we just put the poor bastard out of his misery? Tony asked. Tony! Steve yelped, sounding outraged and looking completely horrified. Sometimes Steve baffled Natasha because his moral compass was about 180 degrees removed from her own. In an almost humorous way, it reminded her of her early days dealing with Clint and Phil. Back then, even their rather gray morals had seemed completely alien to Natasha, as she'd had basically none at the time. Tony didn't back down and barreled ahead before Steve could start to rant. Steve, the guy's been getting his brain scooped out and rearranged since the 40s. There's a damn good chance he won't ever be able to function as anything other than what they've made him. And there's an about equal chance that even if we can get him to function, he'll be so horrified by what he's been forced to do for so many years, he'll commit suicide. If that's the case, putting him down might end up being the kindest thing we could do.
Tony is right, Natasha said. I was fairly young when I escaped from the clutches of my controllers, and I am still coming to terms with what they made of me. He has been under their control for nearly 70 years.
He still deserves a chance, Steve said, a stubborn look on his face. Yeah, but we need to be ready for the worst case, Steve, Tony said. Loki spoke up at that point.
Mother might be able to do something for him, both to reclaim the man he was and to help him deal with what he has been forced to do.
Aye, Thor agreed. That got them all looking at the pair curiously.
I cannot be certain, Loki said. It depends upon how this brainwashing was accomplished and what, if anything, remains of the person he was before he was turned into a weapon. That he was fighting the brainwashing some decade plus after he'd been captured and brainwashed is actually a good sign. It means that at least at that point, there was something left of who he had been that was fighting what he'd been turned into. If that spark remains, his chances, and Mother's ability to help him, will be much higher.
Steve looked pleased. Well then, with that sort of option. This time he shot Natasha a look. Do you have any idea who he was?
Natasha shook her head. No, she said. I strongly suspect he was not originally Russian. But other than that, nothing. He always had that mask on when in the presence of anyone but his own trainers, and rarely spoke outside of mission-relevant matters. And even then, he was as monosyllabic as was practical.
So, first things first, take off the mask and let Jarvis get a look at his face, Tony said. We might be able to track down who he was, especially since he was grabbed it during the war. He was probably a soldier, which means there'd be a record of him somewhere that Jarvis can get hold of. You got a good hold on him, Loki Dokes? I don't fancy getting my face smashed in. Loki gave a nod.
He will not slip my grasp,
he assured Tony. Tony walked over to the man, then glowered briefly at Loki, because Tony wasn't in his suit, and the guy, who was nearly as tall as Steve to start with, was a good foot off the ground, which meant his head was far enough over Tony's head to make removing the mask problematic. Loki smirked, but lowered the man until he was standing on the ground. Tony flipped him off with a grin and then turned his attention to the mask. It took him a moment to figure out how the thing came off, but then he got it worked out and undid the clasps. Roughly a second after the mask was off the guy's face, all hell broke loose.